The heavy steel bucket of an excavator hovered inches from Luiza's face, the smell of hot diesel exhaust choking the morning air. She stood on her diner's porch, arms spread wide, watching her hand-carved sign splinter under a worker's crowbar, while the town councilman she'd known for 30 years refused to meet her eyes. Just as she stepped forward to scream, the rhythmic grinding of the machinery was drowned out by the wet, sickening crunch of a heavy stone shattering her front window, sending a spray of glass diamonds across the very floor where she had served the town's secrets for decades. Hours later, knee-deep in the wreckage of her life, Luiza's flashlight beam caught a flash of white inside a rain-soaked trash bin behind City Hall. She pulled out a singed folder, her fingers trembling as she wiped away the grime to reveal maps of the town with red X marks over its most sacred landmarks. A patrol car's siren wailed in the distance, getting closer, but Luiza couldn't move. She was staring at a signature on the bottom of a secret contract that turned every friendly face in Pine Hollow into a potential predator. The bell above the door jingled with a sharp, metallic ring, sounding like a coin dropped on tile. Luiza Marshall didn't need to turn her head to know who had arrived. The uneven, heavy shuffle of Mrs. Hargrove's orthopedic shoes was as familiar as the scent of scorched coffee that always seemed to linger near the back burners. Luiza adjusted her starched apron, the fabric crackling under her fingers, and smoothed a stray lock of gray hair back into her messy bun. "You're out of the blueberry, aren't you?" Mrs. Hargrove's voice cut through the low hum of the diner's refrigerator with the precision of a dull saw. Luiza wiped her palms on her apron, her hands still dusted with the ghost of flour from the morning prep. The pie case stood half empty, its glass smudged where children had pressed their faces against it earlier. Last slice went to Tommy Riggs, said his ma was too tired to bake. She didn't mention the way the boy's hands had trembled when he counted out the pennies, or how his shirt collar had been turned inside out, a sign of a household falling apart at the seams. Mrs. Hargrove huffed, a puff of peppermint-scented air hitting Luiza's face. "That boy's got no business eating pie when his daddy's still laid up at the mill." Her knuckles rapped the Formica counter, once, twice, testing for rot, or perhaps just testing Luiza's patience. The coffee machine hissed, steam curling around Luiza's wrist as she poured a fresh cup. "Black, no sugar," she said, sliding the ceramic mug across the counter. The dark liquid sloshed, leaving a ring on the chipped edge. Outside, a truck backfired, the vibration rattling the silverware in its trays and making Luiza's heart skip a beat. She forced her fingers to stay still, even as the woman began to drone on about the new housing development and the Miller place being torn down. Underutilized land. Mrs. Hargrove sneered, stirring coffee she intended to drink neat. Luiza's throat tightened. She thought of Mrs. Miller's hands, veins like blue rivers, handing over jars of peach preserves. The world was changing, sharpening into something Luiza didn't recognize. But for now, the diner remained her fortress. She turned toward the back, the smell of fresh ground Arabica and vanilla sugar providing a temporary shield against the gray reality of Pine Hollow. The morning rush began to swell as the sun climbed higher, casting golden strips across the checkered floor. Luiza moved with the practiced grace of a woman who had spent half her life in this square footage. She caught the eye of Gary, an old farmer whose skin looked like weathered leather, and filled his mug before he even asked. The steam rose in a thick column, carrying the comforting weight of breakfast, fried bacon, toasted rye, and the deep, jammy scent of her signature blackberry apple pie. "There you go, Gary. Crust is extra flaky today," Luiza said, sliding the plate over. She watched him break the golden pastry with his fork, the deep purple juice staining the white porcelain. She took a moment to wipe a stray crumb from the table, her eyes wandering to the old black and white photographs of Pine Hollow that lined the walls. This place was a museum of sorts, a repository of every secret and every meal shared in this town for 30 years. The bell jingled again, but this time the sound wasn't sharp, it was heavy. The door swung open with a violent thud against the stopper, jarring the peaceful atmosphere. Luiza looked up, her smile faltering as she saw a man in a stiff, navy blue uniform accompanied by Arthur White, a member of the town council and a man Luiza had known since he was a boy, with skinned knees. Arthur wouldn't look at her. He stared at the tips of his polished shoes as if they held the secrets of the universe. The judicial officer stepped forward, his presence cold and bureaucratic, and placed a thick, cream-colored envelope on the counter. The paper crinkled, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden silence of the diner. "Luiza," Arthur started, his voice thin. "The zoning committee, the redevelopment project. It's been finalized." Luiza's gaze fell to the envelope. The bold black lettering of the header screamed, "Notice of eminent domain and compulsory demolition." The air in the diner suddenly felt thin, the smell of coffee turning acrid and suffocating in her lungs. Arthur reached into his breast pocket and offered her a pen, his fingers trembling so slightly she might have missed it if she hadn't been looking for a sign of a soul. "Sign it, Luiza. It's better this way. The compensation is fair." Luiza didn't take the pen. Instead, she pushed it away with a sharp flick of her wrist, watching it roll across the formica and vanish into the gap beneath the industrial refrigerator. "Fair?" she spat, the word tasting like bile. "You come into my house, Arthur, the house where your mother used to sit and cry when your father was on the bottle, and you talk to me about fair." Her voice rose, a low-frequency rumble that made the spoons in the sugar jars vibrate. She slammed her palms onto the counter, the sound like a gunshot. "Look at these walls. Look at Gary over there. You're not just tearing down bricks and mortar. You're tearing out the heart of this town so some developer can build condos no one here can afford." Arthur flinched, his face turning a mottled purple. "It's progress, Luiza. Pine Hollow is dying. We need the tax base. Pine Hollow is dying because men like you are suffocating it." Luiza grabbed the notification, crumpled it into a tight, jagged ball of paper, and hurled it at the officer's chest. "Get out! Get out of my diner before I show you how underutilized my cast iron pans are." The men retreated. But the victory felt hollow. Outside, the low, rhythmic growl of diesel engines began to vibrate through the floorboards. Luiza hurried to the window, pulling back the grease-stained lace curtain. A massive yellow excavator was lumbering down the street, its steel treads grinding against the asphalt with a sound that set her teeth on edge. It didn't pass by. It slowed, the hydraulic hiss of its brakes sounding like a predatory sigh, and parked directly in front of the diner's entrance. The heavy steel bucket lowered, hitting the pavement with a bone-jarring clank that made the glassware on the shelves dance. Within minutes, a crew of men in neon orange vests began unloading rolls of striped caution tape, cordoning off the sidewalk and the diner's small parking lot. Luiza watched, paralyzed, as her livelihood was transformed into a construction site. "They can't do this," Tommy Riggs whispered from a corner booth, his eyes wide. Luiza didn't answer. She was already out the door, the humid air hitting her like a physical blow. The smell of wood smoke and autumn leaves had been replaced by the stench of diesel exhaust and churned earth. 3 workers were already leaning ladders against the diner's facade. One of them, a man with a thick neck and a smirk that suggested he enjoyed his work a little too much, raised a power drill. The whine of the drill bit into the wood of her sign, the hand-carved Luiza's that Joe had made for her a year before he died. The first letter, the L, was pried loose and fell into the mud with a dull thud. "Stop it!" Luiza screamed, rushing toward the ladder. The man with the thick neck stepped down, blocking her path. He smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap cologne. He didn't move, just looked down at her with a mock sympathetic grin. "Move along, lady. We got a job to do. Unless you want the roof coming down on your head while you're still flipping burgers." He gave her a shove. Not enough to knock her down, but enough to assert dominance. Luiza felt the heat of 1,000 suns rising in her chest. She didn't retreat. Instead, she climbed the 3 steps of her porch and turned toward the street. A few cars had stopped, drivers leaning out of windows to see the commotion. "Look at them!" Luiza shouted, her voice carrying over the roar of the idling excavator. "They're stealing our town. This isn't about progress. This is about Miller and his pockets." She stood there, arms spread wide. A solitary figure in a stained apron, defying a wall of yellow steel. The crane's arm hovered just feet from her head, a giant iron finger pointed at her chest. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The prober yelled, the trucks honked, but Luiza didn't move. She stared into the eyes of every passerby, trying to find a spark of the old pine hollow, the one that wouldn't let a neighbor stand alone. Night fell with a heavy, oppressive darkness. Luiza sat inside the darkened diner, the only light coming from the flickering street lamp outside. She was exhausted, her bones aching from the day's standoff. She must have drifted off into a light, fitful sleep, because the sound that woke her felt like a dream, until the cold air hit her face. Crash. The sound of shattering glass exploded through the room. Luiza bolted upright, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She grabbed a heavy flashlight from under the counter and clicked it on. The beam cut through the dust-filled air, revealing a nightmare. Her front window, the great pane of glass she spent every Monday polishing, was gone. In its place was a jagged hole, and the floor was a sea of glittering diamonds. A heavy river stone lay in the center of a collapsed table, surrounded by the shards of her best porcelain tea set. But it wasn't just the window. Black paint had been splashed across the walls, dripping down the photographs of the town like oil. "Move out or burn." The letters screamed from the back wall. Luiza sank to her knees, the glass crunching under her shoes. She picked up a piece of the fallen sign, her fingers tracing the carved wood. The smell of ozone and damp earth drifted in through the broken window. They were trying to scare her. They were trying to turn her home into a tomb. She didn't cry. The grief was there, but it was buried under a layer of cold, hard granite. She stood up, grabbed her dark work jacket, and headed out the back door. If they wanted a fight, she would find the weapons they were using. The town was silent as she slipped through the shadows toward the civic center. Pine Hollow's town hall was a red brick building that looked more like a prison than a place of service. Luiza knew the layout. She'd delivered lunch to the clerks for years. She circled to the rear, where the massive industrial bins sat in the alleyway. She began to dig. It was filthy, degrading work. She moved bags of shredded paper and discarded lunch containers, her hands slick with something she didn't want to identify. Just as she was about to give up, her flashlight caught a flash of bright blue. It was a legal binder, wedged between a stack of old newspapers and a pile of coffee grounds. Luiza pulled it out, her heart racing. The cover was embossed with the seal of the mayor's office. Suddenly, a door at the top of the metal stairs creaked open. A shaft of light spilled into the alley. "Who's there?" a voice called out. "Officer Miller, the mayor's nephew." Luiza froze, her breath hitching. She shoved the binder under her jacket and ducked behind a massive grease trap, just as the beam of a flashlight swept over the trash bins. The light lingered on the spot where she had been standing seconds before. She could hear the heavy thud of the officer's boots on the metal stairs. Step, step, step. He was coming down. Luiza squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her back against the cold, slimy metal of the trap. The light passed over her boots, missing them by an inch. Probably just a raccoon. Another voice called from inside. "Come on, the game's back on." The boots retreated. The door slammed. Luiza didn't wait. She bolted, running through the dark alleys, her lungs burning, until she reached the safety of her kitchen. She spread the documents out on the wooden table under the dim glow of a single bulb. As she flipped through the pages, the true scale of the betrayal unfolded. It wasn't just her diner. The blueprints showed a massive complex. Condos, a private shopping mall, and a gated entrance. To build it, Miller hadn't just sold her land. He had sold the public park, the one dedicated to the veterans of the Great War. There were spreadsheets, ledgers, sums of money listed as consultation fees paid to every member of the council, with Miller taking the lion's share. The Pine Hollow Revitalization Project was nothing more than a funeral shroud for the town, sold to a developer in the city for millions in kickbacks. Luiza sat back, the silence of the house weighing on her. She looked at the photo of Joe on the mantel. He had died because he trusted the system to listen when he said the breaks were bad. She wouldn't make that mistake. She wouldn't let them bury the truth in the same mud they were using to bury her diner. The next morning, Luiza didn't open the diner. Instead, she took a stack of photocopies to the town square. She stood on the base of the founder's statue, the wind whipping her hair into a frenzy. "Listen to me," she shouted at the people heading to work. "Look at what your mayor is doing. He's selling the park. He's selling your history." She began throwing the papers into the air. They swirled like snow, falling into the hands of the butcher, the schoolteacher, the mechanics. People stopped. They began to read. Luiza saw the confusion turn to murmurs, and the murmurs turned to a low, vibrating anger. She pointed at the mayor's office window, her face flushed with a righteous heat. But then, the air was sliced by a piercing electronic screech. A set of massive speakers, mounted on the town hall balcony, roared to life. Mayor Miller stepped out, looking every bit the polished statesman in his silk tie. His voice, amplified to a deafening volume, drowned her out instantly. "Friends, neighbors." Miller's voice boomed, smooth as honey. "Please, ignore poor Luiza. We all know she's been struggling since the loss of her husband. The stress of the new development, it's clearly unhinged her. We've already reached out to medical professionals to get her the help she needs." He looked down at her with a mask of perfect, practiced pity. Behind him, assistants began tossing out glossy brochures that looked far more professional than Luiza's grainy copies. The brochures spoke of modern Pine Hollow and economic rebirth. Luiza tried to scream back, but her voice was a gnat against the thunder of the PA system. The people who had been holding her papers began to look at her differently. They saw a disheveled woman shouting in the street, while their mayor promised them prosperity. The seeds of doubt were planted. By that afternoon, the retaliation moved from the public eye to the shadows of the law. Luiza was in her kitchen, trying to salvage what she could from the broken front room, when the back door was kicked open. 3 men in white coats, followed by 2 fire marshals, marched in. They didn't speak. They began ripping the place apart. "Health code violation," one shouted, dumping a jar of flour onto the floor. "Fire hazard," another yelled, pulling the ancient, seasoned copper pots from the walls and throwing them into a heap. Luiza tried to stop them, but an inspector shoved her back, his elbow catching her in the ribs. He took a heavy wrench to her espresso machine, the beautiful chrome-plated heart of the diner. With a single, brutal swing, he smashed the pressure gauge. A geyser of scalding steam erupted, hissing like a wounded animal. "Critical failure," the man said, marking his clipboard. "This building is a death trap." They didn't just inspect, they erased. They stayed until the diner was a shell, draped in yellow caution tape and smelling of chemicals. Luiza stood in the center of the ruin, her hands shaking. She needed to get away, to think. She climbed into her old delivery van, the engine groaning as it turned over. She needed to drive up to the ridge, to the one place she could see the whole valley and breathe. She didn't notice the wet patch on the pavement where she'd been parked. She didn't see the clean diagonal cut in the brake line. As she hit the first steep curve of the mountain road, she pressed the pedal. It went soft. It sank to the floorboard with a sickening pop. "No, no, no," she gasped, pumping the brakes. Nothing. The van began to pick up speed, the heavy frame swaying as it hurtled toward the hairpin turn. Below her, the cliff dropped away into a jagged ravine of pine and granite. She yanked the emergency brake. The cable snapped with a sound like a whip. The world became a blur of green and gray. Luiza gripped the wheel, her knuckles white. She couldn't make the turn. She saw the concrete barrier approaching and, in a split second of instinct, steered the van toward a thicket of wild berry bushes on the uphill side. The impact was a bone-shaking jolt. The windshield shattered, and the world spun until the van came to a rest, tilted at a precarious angle in the dirt. Luiza sat there, the silence of the mountain rushing back in. The smell of crushed pine needles and leaking coolant filled the cabin. She was alive. But as she climbed out, limping, she saw a black sedan idling at the top of the rise. It watched her for a moment, then sped away. She walked back to town, every step a sharp needle in her hip. She reached the diner just as the sun was setting, hoping to find Toby, her cook, and the boy she'd treated like a son for 5 years. She saw him. He was standing by the back door, talking to a man in a dark suit, one of Miller's fixers. Luiza froze in the shadows of a maple tree. She watched as Toby handed over a spare set of keys to the diner. In return, the man handed Toby a thick, white envelope. Toby tucked it into his jacket, his face twisted in a look of shame that couldn't hide his relief. "Toby," Luiza whispered, stepping into the light. The boy jumped, his face turning the color of ash. "Luiza, the bank was going to take the house. My mom's medicine. Miller said he'd take care of it. He said you were going down anyway." Luiza looked at him, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly old. The betrayal was a physical weight, heavier than the van, heavier than the diner. She didn't yell. She didn't even move. She just watched as he turned and ran into the darkness, leaving her alone in the wreckage of her life. The next morning was the festival of the autumn harvest, the biggest day in Pine Hollow. Luiza woke up in her small house to a strange sound, a rhythmic thump, thump, thump. She tried the front door. It wouldn't budge. She ran to the back. It was barred from the outside with heavy pine planks. They had boarded her in. "Hey!" she screamed, hammering on the wood. "Let me out!" Beyond the walls, she could hear the high school band starting to play. The festival was beginning. Miller was going to announce the new development today, with the whole town watching. She looked around her kitchen, her eyes lighting on a heavy cast-iron skillet. She didn't hesitate. She swung it with everything she had against the kitchen window frame. The glass exploded. She cleared the jagged edges with the skillet and tumbled out into the dirt, her skirt catching on the sill and tearing a long strip of fabric away. She ran. She didn't go through the main streets. She moved through the alleys and the backyards, a ghost in a torn dress. When she reached the edge of the square, she stopped. The park was gone. In its place stood a stage, and next to it, a massive, gleaming model of the new Miller Heights complex. It looked like a tombstone for the town. 2 men in camo gear, private security, were patrolling the perimeter. Luiza ducked behind a row of trash bins, the scent of rotting peach pits filling her nose. She saw a gap between 2 tents and bolted. "Hey, you!" one of the guards shouted. Luiza didn't look back. She dove into a narrow gap between the bakery and the hardware store. It was a dead end. The guards were right behind her, their heavy boots splashing through the mud. She saw a stack of empty apple crates. As the first guard reached for her, she shoved the stack with a desperate strength. The crates cascaded down, a wooden avalanche that tripped the men up just long enough for her to scramble over a low fence and into the service area behind the main stage. She was panting, her lungs screaming. She found herself in the shadows behind the heavy velvet curtains. Through a crack, she saw Miller. He was at the podium, his face glowing with triumph. "And so," Miller proclaimed, his voice echoing across the square, "we embrace a future of wealth and stability." Luiza felt a hand on her shoulder. She spun around. It was Miller's head of security. He reached for the binders she had tucked into her waistband. Luiza didn't think. She dropped to the floor and crawled into the dark, cramped space beneath the stage. It was a forest of wooden pillars and electrical cables, smelling of rats and damp earth. Above her, the floorboards groaned under the weight of the mayor's ego. She crawled, the rough wood scraping her back, until she saw the base of the microphone stand. She popped up like a jack-in-the-box, throwing the curtain aside. The bright stage lights blinded her for a second. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that sounded like a wind through the pines. Luiza grabbed the microphone. Miller froze. His face went from triumph to a mask of pure, murderous rage in a heartbeat. He lunged for her, but Luiza dodged him, wrapping her arms around the heavy metal stand. "Listen!" she screamed into the mic. The feedback shrieked, a piercing wail that made the front row flinch. "I have the ledgers. I have the names." Security swarmed. 2 men grabbed her arms, trying to pry her fingers loose. Luiza kicked, her heavy work boots finding a shin. She held on, her voice cracking but steady as she began to read. October 12th, $50,000 to Miller's private account from Apex Development. November 4th, payments to Councilman White. They aren't building a future. They're selling your park to pay for their beach houses. The crowd erupted. It wasn't a cheer, it was a roar of confusion and dawning realization. People began to surge toward the stage. "She's lying," Miller screamed. But he wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at the binder. He knew. Luiza didn't stop. She read the names. She read the insults Miller had written about the ignorant locals in his private notes. She showed the town the face of the man who had been smiling at them while he sharpened the knife. The square turned into chaos. The police, led by the sheriff, a man who still remembered the taste of Luiza's pies, didn't move to stop the crowd. They moved to the stage. The sheriff stepped up, his hand on his belt. He didn't look at Luiza. He looked at Miller. "James," the sheriff said, his voice low but carrying through the live mic. "I think you need to come with us." The click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound Luiza had ever heard. The aftermath was not a celebration. It was a long, slow exhale. The developers fled, their contracts annulled by a state investigation that descended on the town like a hawk. The excavator was towed away, leaving deep, ugly scars in the asphalt in front of the diner. Luiza sat on her porch a week later. The caution tape was gone, but the diner was still dark. The windows were boarded up with plywood. Toby had left town, and Arthur White wouldn't come out of his house. The town was saved, but it was broken. The trust that held Pine Hollow together had been stripped away, leaving something raw and uncertain. Luiza looked at her hands. They were scarred, bruised, and tired. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a woman who had saved a house only to find the foundation was made of sand. She stood up, grabbed a crowbar, and walked to the front door. She jammed the metal into the wood and pulled. The nails groaned, a long, protesting screech, until the first plank fell away. A shaft of sunlight hit the dusty floor of the diner. It caught the scent of vanilla and old wood, a faint, stubborn ghost of what had been. Luiza stepped inside. She had a lot of work to do. The pies wouldn't bake themselves, and the town needed to learn how to eat together again. It would be a long winter, but for the first time in a long time, the air smelled like rain instead of smoke.